Hey everyone, it's Clint. Welcome to Sweetcast, and I want to talk about this interview and some of the points made by Michael Golden in this interview here in the Texarkana news. So we're going to get into that. First, Fatal is on Indiegogo right now. Check it out in the link in the description below. We only have 20 days left in the campaign. There's no more extensions. That's the end of the campaign. So back it, check it out, back it. This is a really nice book. Pick yourself up a t-shirt if you have already backed the book and haven't got your t-shirt yet. And I'm stoked to see where this goes. We want to get to 70K as soon as possible. That's the next stretch goal, but that's also an important it's helping us stay on track to get around 100K. And I think that's massive, especially for two guys that don't have experience in the mainstream industry, which is actually exactly what I'm going to be talking about in this video. Not having experience in the mainstream industry. So something interesting here, like here, right here off the top, right off the bat. Comic artist Michael Golden says the corporate side is still valuable for learning the basics. That is such a loaded statement that it's wild. So let me unpack that a bit. The fact that it's still valuable means that he has to justify the value of the mainstream comics industry. And what he means by that is Marvel and DC. That's what he says specifically, that Marvel and DC are still valuable to creators for learning the ropes, learning the basics of comic creation, and all that kind of stuff. So they're valuable for you to get your feet wet, to learn things. But the value of creating comics is not inside of comics. It's actually moving outside of comics and doing something else entirely. That's just going to make more sense. Wild, I know. So it would either be moving out and doing, some kind of other art job, working in video games, doing art, working in advertising, working in any number of places to do art, or it would be to be in independent comics, doing your own thing there. All right, so comic artist and writer creator Michael Golden visited Texarkana's Excalibur Comics and Games on Saturday, signing autographs, producing sketches, and sharing tales of his journey in the comic book industry. This is what comic creators do when apparently there are no conventions. So you're going to go specifically to one comic shop. I don't have a problem with that. Go for it. Knock yourself out. But it is kind of sad that that's the state of the industry right now. Let's see. Much has changed since the 70s. Okay. We get it. We get it. All right. So he says, I only worked in comics full time for 2 years, Golden says. I realized quickly that the pay was not great. My main bread and butter in art is the commercial art world, but I've had the fortune to draw for Marvel and DC and others. So again, being a professional working in comics, it seems like the misconception is that you're 100% working in comics. And most of the time, or much of the time, that's not actually the reality. The reality is you've got something else to pay the bills. Working in comics is sort of this passion project that you do a little bit of, because either there's not enough work that pays consistently enough, or it just doesn't pay well enough at all. And so you're just going to take it, or maybe you've got a hole in your schedule or something. And so you'll do comics work. That could be a possibility. So what value though this is the question that immediately comes to my mind, is what value is there for working in the mainstream comic book industry? There are several pros that have worked or still work for Marvel and DC, and they've moved over and they're doing crowdfunding, and their names carry some weight, because they've had those careers working on these famous characters that you know of. There seems to be some success that carries over into crowdfunding, and that they're able to sort of capitalize on their experience there at Marvel and DC, even though they weren't paid well, which is relative, and also that it wasn't long term. They couldn't be creative, so on and so on and so on. At the same time, they move over to crowdfunding. They sometimes make a lot of money, and sometimes there are some creators, professionals that have worked in comics, who move over to do crowdfunding and who get really suboptimal numbers. Why is that? I think it's because there's a little bit more than just working for Marvel or DC. And the other question is, can you learn those basics without having worked for Marvel or DC? All right, so here's another quote from him. He says, technology has brought some of the greatest changes. He's speaking of the industry. It used to be if you wanted to be in comic books, you had to go to New York, where the publishing offices for both Marvel and DC Comics were located at the time. They were the gatekeepers. Independent books did exist even then, but the way is much harder. Now anyone anywhere can get their start relatively inexpensively. There's a lot more players out there, but there's a lot more opportunity. And indeed, there are a lot more players out there as well. Uh, and then he acknowledges that the big two in comics have made decisions that have not been the best for the iconic properties they own. But part of that is times changing. As mythological figures change hands, so does the perception of them and how stories are told about them. But he also said the market does play a factor. That is super gray. All of that is very gray. But essentially, I don't know. I guess he said they haven't made the best decisions. That could mean a lot of things, especially as to whose hands are they in that they do well and don't do well. All right, here, last quote here. He says, "Whatever you think of the product Marvel and DC are producing now, they are still places a new comic creator can learn the basics of the trade." And this is what the headline quote is from, essentially. So even if you don't like Marvel or DC, if you don't like the direction that things have gone, they're still valuable because you can go there and learn like you would at a preschool or something. It could be your internship. You could think of it that way. You could go learn about the trade. But what about a career? Not just learning the basics. What about a full-fledged career? Okay, he continues. It is like going to work for McDonald's or Burger King. Yikes! That is a dangerous comparison. That may not be the most creative environment, and may not be where you ultimately want to go in that business. But as far as learning the basics of the craft and the business, it's good training. As for the creative decisions being made now among big players and the market ultimately will show the way, as the customers will always let everyone know eventually. The modern comics world is a bit of a wild west. That's the future I see. Get out there. The opportunities are endless. All right. So if you want to work for the equivalent of fast food in comics, you could work for Marvel and DC. But for some reason, it just seems that whether it's willingly or unwillingly, fans give that kind of experience a lot of credence, even though, like, here's a professional comparing it to McDonald's or Burger King. It's just wild. Uh, Ultimately, though, what I think about this, you take a step back. The ultimate goal here is not to be working for Marvel and DC. And I think very few creators, even ones that are currently working for Marvel and DC, see that as the end game. Many of them creatively want to be doing their own thing and financially want to be doing it and getting paid well to do it. There's some examples of people that are who are really crushing it and they can do it full time, and it makes a lot of sense for them. Other examples where I don't know how it's gonna work for some. So it'll be interesting to see as things evolve. But I like seeing more and more comics pros, just you know, saying it in a matter of fact way that there are problems in the comic book industry. Marvel and DC are not the end all be all. It doesn't make you a bigot to say that. And I don't know. There may be some other better options in independent comics that you're not getting from Marvel or DC. All right. Here's one more quote here. Comics are a unique American art form. Overseas talent has gratified to the medium. The kinds of stories comics excel at are the stories of humans wanting to be better. It will be interesting to see how the medium and the art form and the people in general evolve from here. And that's, I mean, if you're talking about universal storytelling, that's what I would say is the problem. Universal storytelling is a problem that any human being out there can relate to. It doesn't matter how poor you are, how rich you are, what color your skin is, anything. Striving to be a better person is a challenge that every human being has had to encounter, uh, probably all the time, but at least once in their lives, it seems like. That is universal storytelling, and that is, I think, the problem in essence. If you boil it down, what Marvel and DC have done wrong over time is they've made it not about universal stories. They've made it about specifically pointing out readers that don't belong, that shouldn't be reading their books, and they go out of their way to try and enforce that. So anyway, just good to see. I don't know, more comic pros speaking out, being truthful about all this Marvel and DC. Tell me what you think, though. Is Marvel and DC the equivalent to McDonald's and Burger King uh, working there? Does it affect your decision at all when you're backing books from independent creators? And don't forget to check out Fatal. It's on Indiegogo right now. It's in the description below. And I will see you in the next video.